June 17th, 1965, 11:30 p.m. Le Procope, Paris, France. Bob Dylan had come to Paris to escape the chaos of his sudden fame in America. At 24, he was already being called the voice of a generation, a burden he was still learning how to carry. He wandered the late-night streets of the Latin Quarter, seeking anonymity in a city that didn't yet know his face, when he ducked into an old café to escape a sudden summer rain. What he found in the dimly lit corner of Le Procope would lead to one of the most extraordinary conversations in the history of American art. A meeting between the young poet of folk music and the aging master of modern prose that would change both their understanding of what it meant to tell the truth through art. In the corner booth sat a large man with a white beard, hunched over a glass of whiskey, writing furiously in a notebook before scratching out lines with violent strokes. Even in the dim light, Dylan recognized him immediately. Ernest Hemingway, the Nobel Prize-winning author whose sparse, powerful prose had influenced every serious writer of the past 30 years. But this wasn't the confident literary lion Dylan had expected. This was a man who looked defeated, angry, and very drunk. Dylan approached the booth hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Hemingway?" The older man looked up with eyes that were both sharp and bleary. "Who wants to know?" "I'm Bob Dylan. I'm a musician from America." Hemingway gestured to the empty seat across from him with a weary wave. "Sit down, kid. Misery loves company, especially American company in this God-forsaken, beautiful city." Dylan slid into the booth, noticing the notebook filled with crossed-out lines and the several empty glasses that told the story of a long evening's drinking. "You look like you're having trouble with your writing," Dylan observed. Hemingway laughed bitterly. "Writing? Is that what you call this?" He gestured at his notebook. "I call it the death rattle of a man who used to know how to string words together." "What do you mean?" Hemingway took a long sip of his whiskey and fixed Dylan with a stare that seemed to see right through him. "How old are you, kid?" 24. 24. Christ. When I was 24, I thought I could conquer the world with a typewriter and a bottle of wine. I thought every sentence I wrote was going to change how people saw everything. He gestured around the café. "Look at this place. I used to come here 40 years ago, full of fire and certainty. Now I come here because it's the only place in Paris where they don't expect me to be Ernest Hemingway." Dylan was struck by something familiar in the older man's voice. The weight of expectations, the burden of living up to your own legend. "You think writing is dead?" Dylan asked. "Not writing, my writing. Hell, maybe all writing. You kids today with your music, your protests, your electric guitars, you're saying things that matter. Literature has become polite, academic, safe." Hemingway's voice grew more animated with frustration. "When I started writing, we were trying to capture truth. Real truth, not the pretty version. Now everyone's so worried about being profound that they've forgotten how to be honest." Dylan leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of truth were you trying to capture?" "The truth about what it feels like to be alive, to love someone, to lose someone, to face death, to be afraid and try not to show it, to feel everything and try to put it into words that make other people feel it too." Hemingway stared into his drink. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling and started performing. Started writing like Ernest Hemingway instead of writing like a human being." Dylan nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. Sometimes I catch myself writing Bob Dylan songs instead of just songs, like I'm trying to be the person everyone thinks I am instead of the person I actually am." For the first time that evening, Hemingway looked truly interested in what Dylan had to say. Go on. When I write a song that's real, I mean really real, it's because I forget about being Bob Dylan and just focus on the thing I'm trying to say, like I'm disappearing and letting the truth speak through me. Hemingway's eyes lit up. That's it exactly. That's what I used to be able to do. Disappear into the story and let it tell itself. Dylan pulled out a small notebook of his own. Can I ask you something? What's the most honest thing you ever wrote? Hemingway thought for a long moment. Maybe the ending of one of my early stories, about a man and woman having a conversation they can't really have. Everything important happening in what they don't say. Why can't you write like that anymore? Because I know too much now. About literature, about style, about what critics expect. When you're young, you write because you have to. When you're old, you write because you're supposed to. Hemingway's voice was growing quieter, more reflective. You lose the desperation that makes good art. Dylan was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised them both. What if you tried writing like you were 24 again? What if you forgot everything you know about being Ernest Hemingway? How do you forget 40 years of being yourself? You don't forget it. You use it. But you approach it like you're discovering it for the first time. Dylan opened his notebook and showed Hemingway a page covered with crossed-out lyrics. Look at this. I'm trying to write a song about a relationship ending. But I keep writing what I think a Bob Dylan breakup song should sound like. All symbols and metaphors and clever wordplay. Hemingway studied the page. What really happened in the relationship? She said I was never really there, even when I was sitting right next to her. She said loving me was like loving a ghost. That's your song right there. That's the truth. Dylan looked at his notebook with new eyes. You're right. It's not about being clever. It's about being honest. Exactly. And honesty is the hardest thing to maintain when everyone's watching you create. For the next several hours, as Le Procope emptied around them and the staff began cleaning tables, Dylan and Hemingway talked about the relationship between truth and art. They discussed the difference between being profound and being real, between writing for posterity and writing for the moment. Around 3 a.m., something shifted in their conversation. You know what your problem might be? Dylan said to Hemingway. You're trying to write important literature instead of just writing. Hemingway raised an eyebrow. Explain. When I sit down to write a song, if I'm thinking about how it's going to sound on the radio or what critics will say, it comes out fake. But if I just focus on the feeling I'm trying to capture, sometimes something real emerges. So you think I should stop trying to write like Ernest Hemingway? I think you should try writing like the person Ernest Hemingway was before he became Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was quiet for a long time, staring at his notebook. Then, without warning, he tore out all the pages he had written that evening and dropped them in the ashtray. What are you doing? Dylan asked. Starting over. Hemingway picked up his pen and began writing, but this time his hand moved more slowly, more deliberately. After a few minutes, he showed Dylan what he had written. It was a simple paragraph about an old man sitting in a café, feeling lost. But there was something different about it, something more vulnerable, more immediate than the polished prose Dylan associated with Hemingway's later work. That's beautiful, Dylan said. It feels true. It feels terrifying, Hemingway replied. But you're right. It feels true. They continued writing and talking until sunrise. Dylan worked on his song about the relationship, stripping away the metaphors and focusing on the simple, painful reality of two people who couldn't reach each other. Hemingway wrote about aging, about feeling like a stranger to yourself, about the fear that your best work is behind you. As dawn broke over Paris, they had both created something new, work that felt more honest and immediate than anything either had produced in months. "You know what I realized tonight?" Hemingway said as they prepared to leave the café. "What?" "I've been writing for the wrong audience. I've been writing for literary critics and prize committees and graduate students. But the best writing is written for the part of people that get scared and lonely and confused. The part that needs to know they're not alone in feeling lost." Dylan nodded. "That's who I try to write songs for. The people who need to hear that someone else has felt what they're feeling." Before they parted ways, Hemingway gave Dylan a piece of advice that would influence his songwriting for the rest of his career. "Never let them make you afraid of being simple. The most profound truths are usually the simplest ones." Dylan replied, "And never let them convince you that your best work is behind you. Sometimes you have to get lost before you can find a new way to be honest." The impact of their all-night conversation rippled through both their subsequent work. Dylan's next album featured some of his most direct, emotionally honest songwriting to date. Critics noted a new simplicity and vulnerability in his lyrics. Less cryptic symbolism, more direct emotional truth. Hemingway, despite his struggles with depression and alcoholism, experienced a late creative renaissance. His final published works showed a return to the spare, emotionally powerful style of his early career, with critics praising their renewed vitality and unflinching honesty. Years later, when asked about influences on his later writing, Hemingway mentioned a young American musician who reminded me that the purpose of art is to help people feel less alone. Dylan rarely spoke about their meeting, but those close to him said it had a profound impact on his understanding of his role as an artist. He often quoted what became his favorite piece of advice: "Write for the part of people that needs to know they're not alone." The notebook pages that Hemingway had torn up and thrown away that night were rescued by a waiter and eventually sold to a collector. Literary scholars who examined them noted that they showed Hemingway struggling to write in an overly elaborate style that was completely unlike his natural voice. In contrast, the pages he wrote after his conversation with Dylan showed a return to the clean, direct prose that had made him famous. Those fragments eventually became part of his final completed story, which many critics consider among his finest work. The lesson of that rainy night in Paris wasn't about writing or music specifically. It was about the courage to remain honest in your work, even when honesty means admitting vulnerability, confusion, and fear. Two artists from different generations and different mediums discovered that the secret to meaningful art isn't sophistication or cleverness. It's the willingness to tell the truth about what it feels like to be human, even when that truth isn't beautiful or profound or comfortable. Ernest Hemingway and Bob Dylan met as strangers in a Parisian café and parted as artists who had reminded each other why they had started creating in the first place. Not to impress anyone, not to win awards, but to help other people feel less alone in the world. And sometimes, that reminder comes from the most unexpected source. A young musician who helps an aging master remember that the best art comes not from what you know, but from what you're brave enough to feel and honest enough to share. If this story moves you, remember that it's never too late to return to honesty in your work, your relationships, and your life. The most powerful truths are often the simplest ones, and the most meaningful art comes from the courage to be vulnerable rather than the desire to be impressive. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation, with someone who reminds you that being real is more important than being perfect, and that the world needs your truth more than it needs your performance.